Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ICG's Digital Academy webinar series. I'm Sally Alsop, the ICG committee member responsible for running our webinar programme. So in today's webinar, we're delighted to welcome Conrad Koyo from Craft, Louise Fraser from Jump Research, and Dan Young from Shed Research. Dan was our overall winner of the Indie Award at the MRS Awards. Our fourth finalist, Julian Watson of Sketch Insight, wasn't able to attend this webinar because of work commitments. We hope that what they say here will inspire you all to enter into our award this year. It opens in May, and you have the opportunity to submit case studies that have been conducted up to 2 years before now. As usual, there'll be a Q&A session at the end of this webinar, so please type in your questions in the question box as we go along. We'll be doing that all together right at the end rather than after each of the individual presentations. But please be clear as to who you're directing your question to when you type it in. So we're really grateful to Indiefield for sponsoring this webinar. Indiefield's mission is to deliver great market research fieldwork so that you can use it to deliver everything else. They provide fieldwork services using every method available, including their exclusive market research panel. They also use behavioural recruitment and targeted sampling backed by Experian data. Their highly valued network of community-based market research recruiters and interviewers covers the whole of the UK and gives access to market research participants that cannot be found through online panels, social networks, and list providers. Before I hand over to Conrad, Louise, and Dan, here are the next webinars to note down in your diaries. Don't forget that we're able to offer great value sponsorship opportunities with each of our webinars, and the last 3 of these shown on the screen are still open for sponsorship. Sponsorship normally costs £100 for a lot of exposure on our website, mailers and social media, and of course on the day. Please contact Lucy, our manager at theicg.co.uk if you would like to know more. So over to our first speaker, and I think this is going to be Conrad. So I'll just change presenter. Are you ready, Conrad?
I'm ready. I'm just waiting for my pop-up.
There we go. You see the pop-up?
I can, but somehow, just bear with me 1 second. Yeah. Unfortunately, dealing with the usual technical, despite our technical test, I just have to do something very quickly.
All we can see is just the box that says the MRS ICG Award for Independent Consultants.
No problem. If you can share again with me, try and share again with me, it should work now, I hope.
I'll take it back. Okay, can you see my screen now?
I can, perfectly.
Yeah, and we'll go back to you. We can see your webcam. We can't see your screen.
Okay, I'm just trying to see how I can share my screen because I don't seem to have.
All right, let me have another go because there were 2 options for you.
There we go. Is that better? Can everyone see my screen?
Yes. Yes, we can see the screen. Yeah, but it's not in full screen mode yet.
Not yet. No, it is now. Lovely. All right. Well, thank you. And sorry for the technical trouble. We did do a test, but somehow it didn't work. Didn't work. Yes. So I could talk about this study for, or actually a set of studies for a very long time. So I'm going to try and keep it brief. I'm going to skip through very quickly. This is actually a set of studies that was that started off in around the spring of 2018. And have been ongoing right up until the COVID pandemic sort of put a stop to cricket, full stop, or at least cricket attendance, full stop. So the client for this one was the England and Wales Cricket Board, good client of ours, and they have done lots of work over the last 5-6 years, showing that cricket is facing a bit of a demographic time bomb. In that, while it has a loyal and relatively large fan base, that fan base is getting older, and younger people are not being drawn into the game in enough numbers to continue to make the sport viable and sustainable in the long term. So while young people are playing cricket, they tend to be a certain kind of young person, and tend to come from what the ECB call cricket families. So cricket is passed down through the generations, but new people are not being attracted to the game, especially not new young people in enough numbers. And this is in the face of increasing competition for their attention and their leisure time, numerous entertainment products within sport and beyond that. So they've identified 3 massive barriers to entry. They call it TCP: time, complexity, and perception. The game takes too long to play. It's too difficult to understand. It takes too long to watch, importantly, and young people especially perceive it to be old, exclusive, the classic sort of pale, male, and stale. So as a reaction, this is now called the 100. It wasn't called the 100. It didn't have a brand. It didn't have any branding when we first came to this work, and we've been integral, I'd like to say, in helping develop all of this. What they did have is an idea that they needed to have a complementary cricket product to complement things like Test cricket and one-day cricket and county cricket, that could appeal specifically to young, diverse urban audiences. And diverse doesn't just mean ethnically diverse, that's part of it, but it also means socioeconomically diverse, so moving away from perceptions of exclusivity, and also a 50-50 female-male split. So it's a very kind of progressive ambition from the England and Wales Cricket Board, not just to get more bums on seats and more money in the coffers to help fund the game, but also to actively change the demographic profile of the sport in line with their inspiring generations strategy. And part of that is about making more people believe that cricket is a game for them. So that's the context for the brief. We got a brief, and essentially this is starting a totally new cricket competition with totally new teams. So many of you will know that cricket is based, has been based for about 300 years on counties. Young people don't have very much affinity with their county at all, and so the Cricket Board wanted to build teams that didn't necessarily even have a geographical identity, but in the end did end up having one, but they were related to cities. And to build not just the competition brand, but also team brands that fans could coalesce around and could also help with the ECB's commercial objectives. So not only were we helping build the team brand, we were also helping build, the competition brand, we were also helping build 8 separate team brands by trying to understand young people's identity formation, essentially, and whether that was geographically based or more culturally based or different ways of getting to the formation of a collective identity, which could then be transposed into these team identities and give them something to hold on to, given that these teams are being built from scratch. So if you like football, you might say Manchester United to you, and lots of things will come into your head. Red Devils, Old Trafford, Munich air disaster. There's a whole mythology. There's a whole brand identity that's very different to, let's say, what Chelsea's might be. That's all well and good if you've had 150 years to build that brand equity. We were trying to do it from zero in the space of a year. Vast project, done 8 times actually, around each of the venue cities, so we could then aggregate up to understand what would appeal about the competition across each of these 8 catchment areas and venue cities. But essentially we did the same process 8 times, and this is where the ICG really came into its own, because we were able to have local teams of independent researchers working in each of the areas to help us scale hugely, because on our own we would not have been able to do this. So we went through this process that you can see on the screen. It is much more to it than this, and I'm not going to talk too much about process unless people want to know and want to hear it, because we're up against it time-wise. But essentially it was a classic mix of sort of ethnography and remote ethnography, qualitative creative workshop, and then quantitative survey. So trying to come at the issue from all 3 different classic angles. Numerous qualitative techniques used, some really interesting quantitative ones as well, to try to get to a place where we could then work with a creative strategy agency, Future Brand, and the ECB and various other agencies trying to deliver the 100. Which was a great privilege for us to be sort of a trusted partner, really, and a consultant for the ECB as much as just a research supplier. So long periods of analysis and workshopping and iteration to get to a place where we ended up with territories, potential routes, testing potential routes, and those ended up being 8 team identities. So that insight's been integral, really, in informing one of the biggest revolutions in one of England's most traditional cultural products. It's worth saying that this has been a highly controversial and has met a lot of resistance amongst the quite conservative cricket establishment for various reasons, and the research has been highly valued by the England and Wales Cricket Board in being able to provide an evidence base, an independent, robust, objective evidence base to be able to justify their decisions. Now, it doesn't mean that everybody involved in cricket still likes those decisions, but they can at least see why they've been made. So at the very basic level, stakeholder management and communication has been a key output of the project. Just developing the brands, the branding for the competition and the teams. Things were going absolutely brilliantly until the pandemic hit. They'd smashed all expectations of ticket sales. The only other cricket competition in the country ever that had sold more tickets more quickly than the 100 was actually the Cricket World Cup of 2019. It also allowed the client to go to a number of new brand partners well beyond the traditional financial services and alcohol that cricket relies upon, to attract new youth brands and just really highly valued commercial partnerships. And crucially, this research also helped with making the case and developing the offer for Sky and for the BBC. So yeah, cricket sales smashing all expectations. Here are some of the commercial partners. Since then, they've also signed up Unilever. You may not have heard of New Era caps, but they're the people who make literally the baseball caps for Major League Baseball. So that's a huge coup for what can be seen as a staid, stuffy sport like cricket. Yeah, and you can see here some of the opposition to the 100. It even has its own Twitter account, oppose the 100. The 100 will be the hangover to cricket, the year that took the biscuit. But that narrative is starting to be changed by using, not just, but partly by using some of our research to be able to communicate why the decisions that have been made have been made. So hopefully I've stuck-ish to my 10 minutes, and I will stop sharing my screen and hand over to Louise, I believe.
I think I have to do that. Thank you very much, Conrad. That was really interesting. I absolutely love your colourful slides, by the way. I think your branding is just really beautiful. Okay, so let's hand over to Louise now. So we can see you, we can see your slides. Brilliant. I'll go back onto mute. Over to you, Louise.
Perfect, thank you. My webcam is now working at the appropriate time, which is very helpful. So I wanted to obviously share with you today the work that we did, which formed the basis of our submission for the ICG Awards this year, which is all about everyone's favourite topic, COVID. We very early on, after lockdown, I think probably the week after, were approached by our regular client, the Scottish Government, with whom we already had a contract in place to be working on creative testing for health campaigns. And they came to us initially just to talk about doing some research with the public around a mental health campaign that they wanted to run during lockdown. It soon became clear that actually what they really to make sure that the way in which they were communicating around COVID was understood and was clear, had impact, was cutting through, and all the kind of things that governments will, any advertiser is looking for when it comes to creating standout ads. So they came to us with this brief, asking us to deliver research to inform their communications. First of all, initially for a 3-week test period, when I think everyone felt that lockdown was going to be a short-lived occurrence. The kind of key part of that brief was that they needed us to be both proactive and responsive to enable consumer feedback to be incorporated into this creative development process, which was happening, like everything was at that time, at breakneck speed. They also needed us to help, I guess, gauge the mood of the nation, if you like. So it was a dual kind of brief in terms of gathering insight that would go into the development and formation of communications, as well as being able to run, I guess, reasonably standard creative testing research amongst the public. So there were a whole range of different topics that we started with and that we ended up having to cover within our research, as you can kind of see from the word cloud on screen. Everything from how people were feeling about lockdown, to restrictions, to looking at the Scottish version of track and trace, which is called Test and Protect, coming up with the branding on that, making sure that it was being communicated in an understandable way. We were looking specifically at young people. We were looking at those who were shielding. We needed to just, I guess, give a sense of how everyone was dealing with the pandemic during that period of time. So, as you might imagine, it was not what one might call an inconsiderable task. There were a few kind of key points that we had to tick off in coming up with the appropriate methodology and figuring out systems and processes that we would need to be able to deliver upon this. The first thing was that it had to be fast, and that's not just in terms of turnaround, which I'll talk to you about a bit more in a minute, but in terms of actually getting the whole thing set up. So I think, as I said, they came to us maybe a week after lockdown, and we really needed to have a system
Hi.
Hi.
Can I interrupt just a second? I think sometimes you're freezing, and I'm just wondering if it would be better to take your webcam off.
Sure, I will do. Okay, I will do that now. Okay, hopefully this is going to work a bit better. I'm not sure what the technical issues are, but so as I was saying, we needed speed. It had to be fast. We needed it though to be robust. And that meant both in terms of making sure that we had high quality recruitment, high quality respondents, but also reliable respondents. If we needed to get people recruited to turn up to groups or sessions at very short notice, then we needed to know that they would do that. It had to importantly be representative, both in terms of geography, so we needed to cover the whole of Scotland in as best a way we could, urban and rural. We needed to think about whether people had access to gardens or not. We needed to think about socio-demographic groups and all the usual kind of demographics, but we also needed to do things like make sure we had enough representation of people who were in the shielding category, for example, so that we, if required, were able to specifically look at their experience and their views. It had to be online, and it's worth pausing for a moment to just reflect on what a kind of general scrabble for to adapt to the new norm that I think we, as many others, will recognise, had to figure out at very short notice with the onset of lockdown. Certainly, speaking about our I guess where we had come from, everything tended to be very traditional in terms of the way in which we conducted qual research. It was very much still travelling around Scotland, speaking to people in person in full size or mini groups or depth interviews, but still very much a face-to-face interaction. So, in line with trying to come up with this solution specifically for the Scottish Government, we were also trying to figure out actually how do we move the rest of our business online, investigating online qual platforms, looking at Zoom and Teams and all of these other systems which are now kind of ubiquitous. But it was a time at which we had to really upskill very quickly to be able to move things online. The final kind of thing that made this, I guess, a reasonably difficult task was that we needed to be able to deliver trusted recommendations. Now, you might think that that's something that is a bit of a no-brainer, and of course we had to be able to do that, and that would be a standard output from every research project. But in this instance, what that translated to meaning was that we needed a senior team who were not afraid to actually say, you're taking the wrong path here, this is not the right way to communicate with the people that you're trying to reach, or this isn't going to work. And that in itself, caused us some pause for thought in terms of how we were going to actually set the project up. What we ended up doing was setting up a bespoke qualitative panel. That was something we'd never done before. We were up to the task, we were excited about the idea, but with all of those considerations that I kind of outlined before, we were very conscious that we had to base it around some real kind of good, strong core values. And the three that I've shown on screen here, I guess, underpinned our whole response. We pulled together an expert team. We worked with other freelancers that we trusted and had worked with before, and that we knew would be able to bring that really senior level of insight, as well as being able to kind of stand up and give a strong recommendation when that was required. We really placed a lot of store on recruitment, and obviously there are many ways in which we could have gone about recruiting respondents for the panel, but we decided, partly also through a feeling of responsibility to our our normal recruiters, and wanting to be able to give them some business and help them to sustain themselves during the lockdown period. So we devised a system which meant that we based our recruitment on those quality recruiters that we knew that we could trust, who would find us respondents that met our specifications, but also importantly were reliable. But we kept them involved in the process, so we didn't kind of ask them to recruit people and hand over their databases to us. We made sure that every single time we had a requirement, we got our recruiters involved, and we encouraged them to do chase-up texts and calls, and we paid them every single time we used one of their respondents on our database, and that continues to this day. It was really important to us to keep them involved and at the heart of the process. And the final thing is the not very sexy bit around it all in terms of setting up a series of systems and protocols that we were able to kind of use as templates, if you like. So that's around costings, around kind of invitation to participate, about the output, for example, but also importantly agreed some tight but specific timescales that we would stick to. Where the client bought into that, we kind of agreed it, and we got into a rhythm of being able to turn things around in a very short space of time. And this, just to give you a wee insight, is what a typical week would look like. And I've kind of shown you it here on a Monday to Friday basis, but suffice to say that an awful lot of this was being done Saturdays, Sundays, Mondays, and so forth. There was no such thing as a distinction between work week and weekend in those days. But as typically we would take a briefing and agree our sample spec on a Monday. The day after that, so day 2, we're doing our recruitment and scheduling, drafting discussion guides. Day 3, we do everything else. We get the stimulus, we finalize our discussion guide, we do all the field work, and we do kind of initial analysis. On the 4th day, we've got a team analysis session. We give a verbal debrief to client and agency, sometimes casts of, tens of attendees to that. And on the 5th day, we provide a summary paper, and we make sure that all of our incentives are paid and repeat. Across the period, that first kind of 3 months of the lockdown, we ended up with these kind of, or this is, I guess, a sort of score sheet of where we got to. So within 2 days of commission of the project, we had 40 fully screened participants ready to get into action, and already in many cases participating in projects by then. By day 7, we had 100, and we carried on every single project requirement, adding more people onto that panel. Across those 12 weeks of April to June, we did 14 projects, so that meant that we were doing kind of on average just over 1 a week. That led to us informing 7 campaigns and a whole lot more. So, for example, when the UK government came out with their change to what they call the lockup, the stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives, when the UK government moved that to stay alert, obviously our clients went to red alert, given the furore that stirred up in the UK from the UK government. So we spent quite a lot of time figuring out what the Scottish government's version of that was going to be, avoiding the words "stay alert," of course. But we, in terms of the numbers of interactions we had to make sure that in every single campaign that we were reviewing and looking at, that we were doing it robustly. And you can see the numbers there of individual depth interviews and groups that we conducted through that 3-month period. And it's worth saying that the panel project has actually continued on to this day. In fact, we have one going into field next week. Overall, it turned out that a whole bunch of positive outcomes. Of course, important that the client was happy and it delivered what they needed. But I think there were some unintended positive consequences that we found throughout our experience of running this project. One was happy recruiters. We really worked closely with them and kept them busy and kept money kind of coming in to them in a way that was very much appreciated. There was an unintended consequence for our panelists as well, who in some instances, we were speaking to people who were shielding, who were living alone, who perhaps hadn't spoken to anyone else for days, and just having a friendly face on the other side of the internet made a real difference to them. In addition to that, they felt like they were being listened to, and that they were contributing in a way to the country's sort of efforts with regards to, I felt that they were doing something to help the COVID efforts, I guess. And last, obviously, but not least, it kept us busy, and that was positive, obviously, in terms of sustaining our business, but also in terms of getting through lockdown, where we would be speaking to people on Zoom calls who were furloughed and were bored and had nothing to do. We certainly didn't have that issue. So there were a huge number of positive outcomes. And as I said, the project kind of continues on to this day. The final thing, just before I kind of run out of time, that I wanted to say was just about the awards process itself, and just to say that, you know, what the project that I've just talked about was not a kind of methodologically brilliant or new or innovative, but you know, there were elements in it that really play to the strengths of independent researchers, and that's what kind of gave us confidence, I guess, to go forward and enter this award. The category is quite broad, and looking at that really gave us confidence to say, well, why not have a go at this? It's pretty easy to enter and it was free. It's a brilliant opportunity to shout out about all of these great projects that independents are doing, like us are doing, and the value that we can really bring to a client. You know, being at the heart of that project, informing government communications, is huge for a little company that comprises two directors. But I think beyond that, actually pausing at the end of that crazy first 3-month period where we had been working, you know, around the clock, and thinking about and just taking stock of that achievement was in itself a huge boost from our perspective. And I don't think that as researchers, as independent researchers particularly, that we often take the time to stop and do that. So I really would encourage anyone who is even kind of swithering about the idea to have a really good think about what you could potentially showcase and give it a go next time. And that is me.
Fantastic, Louise. Very impressed with all that, particularly as we do quite a lot of government research. And I must admit that it certainly looks as though you jump. So you're very much in tune with your brand name, brand identity. Absolutely agile, nimble. Yeah, wonderful. Okay, so our next presenter, hopefully he's ready to take over, will be Dan Young. Last but not least, Dan.
Hello. Just going to try and show my screen. Okay, can everyone see that? I'm assuming so, if I haven't heard otherwise. Hello, and thank you. Oh, hello.
Fine. It looks fine on screen mode. I'll go on to mute again.
Brilliant. Right, thanks, Sally. Well, thank you for having me. Apologies, sorry, my screen's gone funny. Okay, just bear with me. Okay. Right, sorry about that. Great start. So I'm here to talk about my awards entry. So it's for a strategic piece of work that we did for Primark back in 2019, if you can imagine. So it was an old project, but I think it really fits the time that we're in now, in the sense that we're all having to rethink our usual approach. As Louise just illustrated, we can't do research as we've always done it before. I think it's quite likely, if they haven't been already, they will be in the future. Budget's restricted, and we're all probably going to face that. And I think there's also a huge amount of data and research that's out there, freely available in the market. Lots of agencies publishing lots of research about COVID at the moment. So in this environment, I think all of us are going to have to look at our approaches and maybe be a bit more resourceful. And this is, I think, a really good example of resourcefulness. So it's a project that we did for Primark. There was an issue in Germany, which I'll explain, the German problem. And rather than commission some more research, and the senior team were ready and able to do that, they decided to take stock of what they already knew, and actually it was enough to give them the answers they needed and move forward. So I'll go through 3 things. So the challenge that they faced, the approach that we took, and the impact, not only the commercial impact, but also the impact on the insight team as a whole. So I imagine the typical ICG viewer today may not shop at Primark, but I think you'll hopefully be familiar with the brand. Back in 2019, seen as a sort of a shining beacon in a declining high street, so outperforming its sector, doing very, very well in the UK, doing very, very well in Ireland, had recently expanded into various parts of the Eurozone, and in Germany, things were not going perhaps as well as other markets, so fewer transactions, lower basket sizes, Lots of different theories as to why this might be the case, discussed at a very senior level within the organisation and outside the organisation among the investment community as well. So what was less clear at this time was why that was the case. So was it ethics? Was it German culture? Was it anything to do with awareness? Was it in-store experience? Was it competitors? Was it because Primark doesn't have an online sales channel? So lots of different theories as to why this might be the case, but Primark needed a single view as to why this was the case and what they needed to do about it. So I think this probably neatly sums up the challenge that Primark faced. This is my client Lizzie. They had 27 different reports. They had over 1,200 pages of insight and research. They were convinced that the answers to this problem were within this bank of knowledge, but they needed help to pull those out, and that's when they turned to me. So I took a fairly simple 4-stage process. This is the process that I follow whenever I do this sort of work, and this is all I do at the moment. It's called synthesis, assimilation, curation, lots of different things. But the first stage is really to explore what's there. So to read everything, to pull out the main insight. You can see a very, very small example of a colourful mind map that I would use just to illustrate where we've got the biggest amount of insights, where we've got our gaps. Really, really useful reference tool afterward if properly referenced back to the original research. So this just helps to boil things down into something more manageable. As you can imagine, 1,200 pages, where do you start? Now you've got something on one screen, a very large screen, but one screen. The next stage is actually just to dig a little bit deeper, actually ask some difficult questions, sometimes some stupid questions, I'll admit, but some difficult questions. As I was outside the organisation, I was able to be objective and really critique where we had contradictory evidence. So if one report said one thing, that ethics was a big problem based on social media listening, was that coming through in the brand data? If it wasn't, why wasn't it? So we're picking apart the methodologies used, really trying to understand the whole picture. And we went around this circle time and time again, almost like the hermeneutic circle that I know Conrad's familiar with. And in the process, I was working very closely with the Primark team, sharing what I knew, hearing their take on it, what it might mean for the business. And that way we're really building our story. Inevitably, there are gaps. There are always gaps when you follow this sort of process. So the things we don't know, but what we're trying to do is reach those known unknowns. One of them was Amazon. So undoubtedly it's having an impact in every market that it enters. For your everyday, reasonably priced fashion, it's definitely having an impact. Amazon, however, because of their success, they don't really have to talk about sales by category. They release some data about US sales and non-US sales, but they don't really go into much detail. I think if the share price ever fell, then investors would be a lot more interested. But at the moment, they don't have to release it. So that's a gap in our knowledge. It was fine for this project to say these are things we don't know. We were able to give them sound advice based on 80% of the information that we had. So that was absolutely fine. And the last stage, and I think probably the most critical stage, was actually building something that gave them a really, really clear direction. Now, our audience was a senior audience. We could have developed a video, we could have developed some sort of infographic or something like that. But actually having a PowerPoint, is the currency of business still, like it or loathe it. We were able to come up with a really, really tight deck, about 15 slides of content, just get straight to the point. We took them on a bit of a journey of the classic German shopper. These are the things that are important to them, and this is how Primark can address each of those. So I said there was a commercial impact, and neither of these two sort of main pieces of insight that came out of this project are particularly groundbreaking, and I'll admit that. They existed in the business already, but what I was able to do through this piece of research was actually elevate these two things. So the first was that Primark fundamentally needed to get more people into their stores. As a very cost-conscious business, they'd never invested in marketing or advertising in the past. That was a real mantra that they lived by. We don't do marketing. So this showed very, very clearly they did need to invest in this. So it's a big cultural shift for the business to actually invest in advertising for the first time. So that's a big win, I think. Secondly, once people are in the stores, they needed to actually stay there. So some issues with the in-store experience. I won't go into detail because obviously commercially sensitive, but that was owned by the retail team. I gave them really, really clear feedback on the things that they needed to focus on, things they needed to sort out. And it was then recognised that things have turned a corner. So this is the finance director of ABF, who own Primark, talking in their last pre-COVID set of interim results. And I think it would be disingenuous of me to claim sole credit for this, or for my client Lizzie to claim sole credit. At the time, and as is often the case, things collided. So at the same time as our work, there was a new management team in Germany who were very receptive to this new approach. So those two things together really started to show the green shoots of recovery in the early part of last year. So awareness was up, customer volumes were up, transactions were up. So everything was moving in the right direction. So that's great. Obviously, things have changed significantly since, and I think probably Primark's lack of an online digital store will be hurting it considerably. But that's probably a story for another day. So that's the commercial impact. There's also a significant impact on the insight team, so all of our clients. So it's really important that they are seen as key decision makers in the organisation, key influencers, seem to be really adding something to their organisation for all of us. This showed that with the right sort of insight to the right people at the right times, then they're able to make really quick decisions, and that was a huge positive. And like any piece of research, if it's able to live and breathe beyond just the customer insight team, that's a fantastic thing as well. And this content was being shared by senior teams in their presentations. They're presenting it back to our clients, so that's fantastic. So it's living and breathing beyond the team. Ironically, because they've now had clarity around the German market and what they needed to do, they could get on and do it. So everybody else was able to focus on other markets. There were a couple of others that were showing signs of an early plateau, so they were able to turn their attention to those. And I think that the biggest one was probably the commercial impact that I've already talked about. So the insight team were able to justify their existence in a very, as I said, cost-conscious business. They could talk about them as actually generating growth for the business, not just being a cost. So that was fantastic for them. So I just wanted to finish with a few lessons that I learned and things that I've definitely taken from this project. One was about focus, and we had a very, very tight brief, but we did have a huge amount of information, and it would have been very, very easy to have lost sight of this brief and just produce another sort of 50-slide deck like the decks that I was looking at. But we were really, really clear on what we were trying to address, and I think as a result we came out with a really, really tight output, which led to better actions. So I think that's something that I've definitely taken from this. Another one is our ability to be objective, and I guess everybody on this call would feel the same, that outside an organisation you're able to really critique what's going. Conrad was talking about being a trusted partner for the ECB, and that's what all of us bring, I think, and that was a big success here, my ability to really critique the past research. Working closely with the client, she was very, very candid with me throughout, and that I think undoubtedly led to its success, because I knew what she was grappling with. I knew warts and all what was going on within the organisation, and I was always taught that's the way you get the best out of any consultant, really bring them into the organisation, and that's what Lizzie was able to do. And because of our audience, the senior audience, I think if we'd just focused on market research and produced a sort of market research summary, I don't think that would have been as successful. We looked at sales data, we looked at market data, we looked at all of the available insight at our disposal, and I think we built a much stronger, more holistic case as a result. So I think that really helped. It took a lot of time. Most organisations that I work with would do this sort of work themselves if they had the time, but they don't, because they've been pulled in lots of different directions. They're constantly commissioning new projects, they're constantly dealing with metering requests, and actually to go through this properly does take time. You need to bury yourself in the insight. So I was able to give Lizzie that time so she could really focus on the biggest success, which was the knowledge management, is getting it to the right people at the right times, and I think that probably shows why it was such a success. So thank you for having me. Thank you for the award. It's been great to be recognised, and it's fantastic to hear from Conrad and Louise as well. They're really interesting studies. I believe I'm going to hand back now to Sally to see if anybody's got any questions.
Yeah, that was really interesting, Dan, and quite a different approach to to undertaking market research. So yeah, very interesting to see the diversity of things that people get up to in the ICG. So we have got a few questions. If anybody else has got more questions, then please do type them into the question box and I will read them out. So the first one, I have to say, I am not a cricketer, and I hope it makes some sense to you. I will read it out and hopefully you'll be able to answer it. Conrad, your 100 model sounds very close to the Indian Premier League. I guess you looked closely at that. That's a question.
Well, we didn't specifically. Yes, it is similar. It's of a similar vein. That the need for something like that was identified before we were brought into the research process, and it's important to say that the people who we involved in our research were specifically, for the most part, not cricket fans, so they wouldn't have had a clue about what the Indian Premier League is, because we didn't want to preach to the choir. Cricket fans like cricket, and despite the opposition to the 100 amongst us, a vocal minority, anytime we've done any work testing the 100 amongst cricket fans, they are the ones who are most up for it, not surprisingly. We were aware of it. We didn't want to replicate it, and for the most part, our research was independent of it, if that answers the question.
I think that probably does, but again, it's on a different planet to the one I live on, so I'll leave that to the
Come on, what's
question.
that? Be convinced.
Over to you, Louise. This is quite a large programme of work. Well done. Was it a competitive tender, and why do you think you won it?
Interesting one. Yeah. So in the beginning, it wasn't, and then it was. Is the very short answer to that. So in order to get something up and running quickly, because we already had an existing contract in place that was used. But after that kind of 3-week period, it then went out to competitive tender, and we won it competitively. I think obviously we had the advantage by then of having delivered over that first initial 3-week period. But I think as well, the kind of key attributes that underpin so much of what we as independents do were so visible there in terms of what we had delivered. So being agile, being responsive, just saying yes and figuring out how to do it later. Being able to kind of field a really senior team who were able to stand up and say, actually, you know, don't do this, as well as, yes, this is how to do it and do it well. So I think, you know, those sort of underlying values really came through strongly and played to helped us to win it when it did go out to competitive tender.
Fantastic. Lots of good reasons to work with independents, definitely. Another question for Dan here. No, first question for Dan. With a 15-slide PowerPoint deliverable to a senior audience, do you get professional slide design input, or is it DIY?
Having seen my slides today, you probably think I need some professional help. I do them myself. I have in the past employed professionals. I'm fortunate to work in a co-working space in Brighton, not at the moment, obviously, but got a couple of local graphic designers that I have worked with, and it's something that I think I would do more of. I guess the big advantage of doing them yourself is that you can be responsive to changes without going through a third party. But it's definitely something that I do and will continue to do in the future.
Okay, another question for you, Dan. Great case study, thank you. The explore stage seems quite open-ended. How do you cost a project like that?
That's a big question. It's interesting because I've had 2 calls in the last week from other ICGers about exactly this, how to cost this type of project, because it is getting a lot of recognition, I think, from clients that they want to do more synthesis work. I've been doing it for a number of years now, so I've got a good feeling for how long it will take to go through a body of evidence. It's asking the questions of the client up front about the number of reports, the nature of those reports. Are they Word reports? Are they PowerPoint? Being quite specific almost like you would do with an academic literature review. So yes, you're right. It can be quite open-ended. I think the trick is asking the questions up front, so you know exactly what you're going to have to go through, and then probably adding a bit, because naturally clients will uncover new things. They'll be commissioning other research and they'll add to your list. So the initial conversations with Lizzie, to give you an idea, I think she said she's going to have about 15 different reports, different pieces of evidence for me, and it ended up being 27. So that gives you an idea. You're right, it can go on. So by my experience, I know that it will increase over time, but what you don't want to do is assume that you can go through everything in a day and cost on that basis, and then you end up spending a whole week going through everything. So I think just build in a bit of contingency.
So do you not allow yourself any flexibility for going back to your client and saying, look, this is taking more time than I budgeted for, or is that something you felt you could?
No, so I mean, I don't tend to do that. That's just that's something I've decided for my business, that I will work on a fixed price basis, and sometimes you overestimate, sometimes you underestimate, and by and large I think it's all leveled out for me personally. I mean, you know, we all want to avoid those awkward conversations where you go back to a client who's already budgeted a certain amount for a piece of work and say, can I have a bit more money? But I have done that in the past, so I think you need to just read the situation and make the best decision for you and your client.
Okay, great. Now, question for all of you really. So with your submissions, how much support did you get from your clients, or did you just get permission to use their brand name? This person has a client, a global analyst advisor company, who wouldn't allow them to use that particular project.
Yeah, I think that's a really tricky one, and I've heard about award entries in the past where clients haven't been willing to share the case studies. I think maybe it's finding an angle. So if you could promise that you would only share certain elements of the study and not all of them, not the commercially sensitive ones. I was quite fortunate that a lot of, I mean, all the data that I showed you there is in the public domain, is freely available for anybody to look at. So I did work closely with my client at Primark. She's been very, very supportive. We have done other webinars for organisations like Aura together as well. So she's fully aware of the content that's out there in the market. But I think not just taking no, and if you feel you've got a really good case study, there might be an angle. And I think people would appreciate if you aren't able to share everything. I think that's still okay.
How about Louise?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we didn't really share any of the results within our case study. We talked much more about the process and the timings and the challenges from our perspective, I guess, in terms of setting it up. So whilst our client was supportive, I don't think they would have been as supportive if I had been coming on saying, well, you wanting to share evidence of campaigns or thoughts that they'd had which didn't make it into the public domain. So I think there's maybe an angle there in terms of thinking about how you can perhaps focus it on you and what you've done, as opposed to necessarily focusing on the actual results from the client.
Conrad?
Yeah, I'd agree with that, and I'd also say focus on the impact the research has had rather than the results as well, which is generally more interesting to everybody and tends to help with award submissions more broadly. It's all well and good having generated some nice data, but what impact did it have is the other angle. I mean, we were very lucky, despite the fact that this is within the cricket world, at least, the hot potato. Or until COVID, this was the hot potato, and really highly controversial. And if you're on cricket Twitter, you'll see how highly polarizing this thing was. But I think our ongoing relationship with the client, without meaning to brag, it was kind of, you know, we worked with them for years, and they trust us, and they were very, very supportive. Not just in this, we've presented this work again at Aura and submitted it for various other awards, and they've been highly involved. And I think in my experience, the research, the award submissions that do well are the ones that do have client buy-in, because they're the other half of this. You know, we're working for them ultimately.
Okay, well, I think that's the last of our questions. So thank you very much indeed, all three speakers. Very interesting and very different submissions. I hope it's given everybody watching some food for thought for the opportunity coming up this year. So thank you to everybody. Thank you to everybody for logging in. Yes, some words of thanks coming through. Sound, great projects, thanks, etc. So thanks again to all of you, and have a great afternoon.